Hello there, I'm Ryan, and this is my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond. And this is part 3 of a 5-part series where I look at the Daniel Craig James Bond films and examine the way in which that character develops over the course of these 5 movies. I think there's a great deal of psychological consistency, a lot of consistency in the dramatic conflicts that character faces, regardless of the stylistic and tonal shifts across these films, that I think is worth exploring and worth paying attention to. And here in Skyfall, in some ways, it's the least interesting of the 5 movies to talk about because so much of the psychological and thematic stuff is right there on the surface. We've talked about how the first 2 movies in the series, Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, make trauma intrinsic to the character, and how the character is essentially bifurcated between this suppressed version of James Bond, the human who might live an existence apart from being an agent of death, and then James Bond, the secret agent who, has suppressed his human side in order to be an assassin. And that formative trauma is really Bond being orphaned. They talk about this in Casino Royale, and here it is explored in great detail. Before Skyfall came out, I never really thought the movies would ever really touch on Bond's childhood to the extent that Skyfall did, and to be honest, it was a source of great anxiety for me in the build-up to Skyfall when it became clear that this was going to be a film that explored Bond's childhood, and that's tricky territory to navigate, and I think it's to Skyfall's credit that it does it as well as it does. Obviously, it's kind of the most Christopher Nolan-inspired Bond entry of these 5 films. It feels very tied to what was going on with the Christopher Nolan Batman films, both in its villain and in its treatment of James Bond as a character grappling with a history of personal trauma and having to overcome that. And so the structure of Skyfall is very clear in the sense that it is a story about essentially a dysfunctional mother-son relationship between M and Bond. And we learn in the course of Skyfall that M has secrets of her own. In the prior 2 movies, Bond was mostly keeping M in the dark about a lot of the things he was doing and what he's going through. And in this movie, the dynamic is somewhat reversed. M is keeping Bond in the dark about the skeletons in her closet. And we find out that she's had a history of almost grooming agents like Bond and developing this sort of affectionate relationship with them. We meet essentially this symbolic brother of Bond's, and it's essentially a story of like sibling rivalry between the good son and the bad son. For this mother figure who's a complicated mother, essentially quasi-abusive. After all, like the inciting incident of Skyfall is her hanging Bond out to dry, so to speak, and she's hung Silva out to dry too. And over the course of this movie, it feels like it's Bond coming to terms not just with his childhood, but also to his complicated relationship with M and MI6 in general. Why is he doing what he's doing? Why is he there? Is it just, is it just his desire for, like, unthinking desire for purpose? Or is it something he really wants to be doing? And the dilemma opens up here. It seems like it resolves at the end of Skyfall, but really it kind of reverberates on into Spectre and No Time to Die, which in retrospect now seems to form like a end of James Bond trilogy. So if Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace were the Bond Begins duology, then Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die kick off the Old Man Bond, End of Bond trilogy of sorts, because they kind of carry over narratively one into the other. Not consistently elegantly, but in ways that are definitely playing off the same material and territory. So as we've talked about, family is very important to these movies, and family is no more directly explored than here in Skyfall. And so, having touched on that, I don't think I need to say so much about that, because there's so much that is very directly explored in this movie about that. But I think it's definitely building on this idea that Daniel Craig's Bond is kind of a very emotionally repressed individual, and Daniel Craig in particular is very good at acting these moments of like kind of like where Bond is very tense, and you almost feel like he's a clenched up individual just trying to hold it together with all this emotion like simmering beneath the surface. He's was very good at that in Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, and here he gets one particularly good moment. It's a very iconic moment now in the movie where he and M pull over to the side of the road while they're in Scotland and have a conversation about Bond's childhood and how M knew about, you know, his upbringing. And Daniel Craig delivers this line like, you know the whole story, and his voice doesn't quite crack, but it kind of like twists in an unnatural way, and it's very striking and very strange. And it's one of these moments for the character that kind of recur. I think like each of these movies have a moment a little bit like that, where you start to see the veneer of this character slip a little bit, and there's a sense of Daniel Craig's James Bond that there's like a fundamental slight like instability to the character that is very different from versions of the character that came before. I mean, this is a character that even in No Time to Die, when the character is seemingly like his most relaxed version of himself across these 5 movies, still has this sort of ability to kind of like at the drop of a hat snap into like really unsettling territory, and we'll talk about that when we get to No Time to Die. But you know, what's interesting about Daniel Craig's performance in this, and I want to give him credit, is so Skyfall suggests that there's been a pretty significant gap between it and Quantum of Solace. Bond, when we meet him at the start of Skyfall, is a seasoned agent. Bond is behaving a lot more like a veteran agent. He's a little bit more familiar with the territory. In the start of the film and over the course of the film, he's playing a sort of mentorship role to Eve Moneypenny, another agent who has kind of joined MI6 and is out in the field with him. And you get the sense that he's seen a lot. His anger over the death of Ronson, I believe is his name, is very much a seasoned veteran sort of anger, but it's sort of detached. Like, you know, he lets that agent go with a resignation, but he's kind of learned to cope with it. The hot-headed rage of the Bond that we saw in Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace is behind him, and there's a little bit more distance. There's a little bit more of a sort of like relaxed nature to the character. This is a character who's been in a lot of high tension situations for a while now and kind of knows how to slip in and out of it. There's a line that occurs as part of a kind of like parallel arc in the movie, which is Moneypenny's arc, which is, will she go back out into the field, or is she going to stay as Mallory's assistant? And Bond pretty much tells her not to go out into the field, and you know, he says the field isn't for everyone, and asks her to really question whether it's, if she wants the life that he has. And it kind of goes back and feels a little bit reflective, right? We have this sort of aspect that Daniel Craig's James Bond is fatalistic. James Bond is a fatalistic character that goes all the way back to Ian Fleming, but there's this sort of like bitterness to it that comes into that half monk, half hitman conversation in Casino Royale. And carries through into this exchange too, which is a little bit softer, a little bit more tender, but you see that Bond has really resigned himself to the reality of this life by this point in time here, and Moneypenny still has an opportunity to get out of it, and he's not really going to encourage someone to come into it. It's a difficult life, and death is almost certain for him, and in fact, he, in the start of Skyfall, nearly dies, and he nearly dies because M hangs him out to dry, and the subsequent story is largely about his resurrection, as he arrogantly tells Silva during their initial meeting. And it's interesting to see how this film deals with a Bond who is feeling really thrown off his game. I've already mentioned this a little bit in Casino Royale because it's so vivid, but when Bond essentially feels like he's now at odds with M, and by extension MI6 as a whole, this relationship is ruptured. His relationship with this surrogate family that has been giving him purpose is ruptured. He drops what we would call the James Bond persona. He just goes and starts crushing Heinekens in a backwater hut where he's, essentially drinking himself into oblivion. And we see that once he doesn't have that sense of purpose and he kind of is doubting that purpose, he doesn't really have something else to turn to, and he doesn't even want to return to the what we might call the James Bond persona. And it's interesting to see how this, and we'll get to this obviously when we talk about No Time to Die, how No Time to Die kind of revisits this idea from a softer angle, because here James Bond's legitimately angry, and it plays into a sort of reprisal of the sequence in Casino Royale where Bond breaks into M's apartment. And in that original version in Casino Royale, M was chastising Bond, and in this version, it's much more Bond chastising M, and M is obviously putting up a strong authoritative presence there. She's not going to yield to Bond, but there is a sense that this relationship in the course of the movie is very much about her coming to terms with her own failings, and in many ways Bond has to come to terms with her failings too, and come to presumably a new sense of purpose for himself. When Skyfall concludes, we get the with pleasure dialogue that Bond has kind of a renewed sense of personal purpose that is presumably not as tied to unthinking, not unthinking, but very like that subconscious trauma in the way that it was before. This seems like very much a movie where he is cathartically letting go of the past, letting go of his entanglement with M that has been motivating him for so long, and feels like he's really in it for himself at that point, embracing his role as the British bulldog, so to speak. And that may explain why once we get into Spectre, he seemed a little bit more relaxed about himself too. And so there's kind of an interesting arc here that Spectre does and doesn't carry forward in different ways. It's interesting, I think, at different points in his engagement with Silva where he feels rattled by Silva in a way that hasn't really happened in the same way before. Obviously, Le Chiffre gets under Bond's skin in their very direct confrontation together, but this idea of him confronting this shadow self is something that is really strongly emphasized here in Skyfall. And actually the shadow self aspect is something that, in its own way, Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die all frame these villains as shadow selves of Bond. In fact, Spectre literally takes it and, rather than going with like the symbolic brother, goes with a very literal half brother as the villain, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in the next video. I find it very interesting too that this movie gives Bond this relationship that we haven't quite gotten in the past two Bond movies, but in Skyfall, it very much starts to embed Bond with a sense of nostalgia, which is in keeping with now Bond is an older individual, a little bit more introspective, and we see that with the, notably with like the cutthroat razor scene, and sometimes the old ways are best dialogue, and this ability for this character to imagine that he will have the upper hand by going to, essentially using like more rustic tools creatively. And one of the things that's very interesting about the character here is that Daniel Craig's Bond is very much, they don't shy away from this word, blunt instrument, essentially. He's brute force over sophisticated technology at any point, and even in Casino Royale, that dynamic is a little bit set up, right? Bond has always had a high friction relationship with technology. He's always been aligned with Q, but always at odds with Q. And this relationship with the technology, you have that sort of comedic byplay with the MI6 support staff when he's poisoned in Casino Royale, and here he's meeting a new young Q who's very techy and very youthful and sharp and very arrogant. And what's interesting is the movie is very quick to have Q pretty much learn from Bond that Bond's old seasoned methodology is better. It's kind of it's a very nostalgically postured movie in general, but this is also the first time with the character that we're starting to feel that he's really starting to feel out of time a little bit. And it's interesting the extent to which this movie and the next two movies are directly putting Bond in confrontation with technological development. In the first movie, Casino Royale, it's really like a battle of personalities and intelligence as he's going up against Le Chiffre. In Quantum of Solace, again, he's kind of playing detective with a really physical edge, right? He's kind of a ruthless interrogator. But starting in Skyfall, you get the introduction of Bond versus the computer era. Spectre continues that in a very, very direct way. And then even No Time to Die is this sense that Bond is being made obsolete by this hyper-tech weapon that has been created by his own government. And we start to see that trend here, and it's interesting that idea is coinciding here in the film where Bond is feeling most directly betrayed by his own side. That betrayal is it's an interesting dynamic. It's not the first time these movies have suggested that political forces in the British government are at odds with Bond. You have that scene in Quantum of Solace where M is pretty much told that she needs to put Bond down, so to speak. And here you get the inquiry scene where Bond is chasing to save M from Silva while she's being ruthlessly cross-examined. And in Spectre, obviously, you have C. In No Time to Die, you find out that Ray Fiennes Mallory has actually, set Bond up for failure, and in fact set the world up for failure by creating the doomsday weapon at the center of that storyline. And it's interesting that this starts to put Bond in a place of outsiderness in his own country, even as it's embracing it. There's a strand here, particularly in the Sam Mendes movies, of celebrating Bond as a British icon, but also Daniel Craig's James Bond having a complex relationship with the trajectory of Britain. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about Spectre. But before we do, I just want to make one final note here about how the other 4 Craig films are very much defined by the Daniel Craig Bond relationship with another romantic potential, whether it was Vesper, Camille, or Madeline. Here, the Bond girl is essentially M. It's very focused on that mother relationship. But Severine is an interesting figure in the sense that she is kind of reprising the Solange role from Casino Royale, this sort of character who Bond is using for information and only for her to meet an untimely end. And there's a very unusual and uncomfortable dynamic between the two characters for a variety of reasons. But one thing the movie does very intentionally is it sort of calls back to Casino Royale, where Bond is on the train with Vesper and analyzes her very quickly and kind of teases her motivations apart. And he does the same thing with Severine, with an added layer of tenderness that seems to recall his relationship with Vesper intentionally without directly referencing it. The next 2 Bond films in the Craig series will directly reference Vesper. Here, it kind of does it from a side angle, and I appreciate the consistency there with which that element of the character is there, but without having to, be a little bit on the nose about it. And I think that scene in particular is very well acted. There's that entire scene at the casino in Skyfall. Daniel Craig has a lovely sense of confidence, but also vulnerability about him that's very different than the arrogance of the character we saw in Casino Royale. Having the wind knocked out of your sails a little bit probably changes who you are, and Daniel Craig's Bond in this is very recognizably an older, more mature version of that same character we saw in the first 2 movies. And that goes a long way in helping me buy into this dramatic idea that there's been a big gap between Quantum of Solace and Skyfall, which you kind of have to just roll with a little bit, even though Craig hadn't aged that substantially between the 2 films. So on that note, let me know if you have any thoughts about anything I had to say here. Hopefully you're continuing to enjoy the series. I'm really excited to talk about Spectre and No Time to Die. Those movies are, they have a lot to dig into, so stay tuned. I have a lot of interesting thoughts about both of those movies, and I can't wait to get those videos out to you all. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.